We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Billionaire explains why U.S. sanctions against Russia have backfired. They are pushing countries away from American investments. Washington's sanctions against Moscow are forcing other countries to cut their investments in the U.S. for fear of becoming the next target. Billionaire hedge fund manager Ray Dalio has said in an interview with German newspaper Der Spiegel. How could these brilliant policy analysts and advisors not foresee this happening? Well, for insight, we turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He is one of our most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So Minister Farrakhan is famous for saying one must never underestimate the blindness that attends arrogance. And so how could these brilliant policy analysts and advisors make such a humongous blunder that now is not only not working out as it relates to Russia, but it has now really changed the global economic dynamic as we look at what's happening in the global South, as we look at what's happening in relationships between Iran and China. I mean, this thing now, when we look at the BRICS, this thing now has totally changed, and I believe forever, the global economic landscape. Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, I think that's a fair point that you make, and I think the explanation is not that complicated. We know that there is a certain amount of ideological incestuousness at the top ranks of the U.S. ruling class, be it in the think tanks in Washington, the universities, the Pentagon, the State Department, the foundations. Those who do not toe the line are either ignored or excommunicated. And that leads to a certain amount, not only of groupthink, but it also suggests that they're high on their own supply. It also leads to an underestimation of so-called rivals and antagonists, with Moscow being number one in that category. How many times on this program have I repeated the estimate of the late Senator John McCain of Arizona, that Russia was a gas station masquerading as a nation? It was Upper Volta with missiles, that is to say, comparing it to a now non-existent African nation was considered to be the ultimate insult. And obviously, this was a blunder of significant magnitude. But I'm afraid to say that even though things are not looking rather rosy for the North Atlantic Bloc right now, because they have this nostrum adapted from late Pentagon Chief Don Rumsfeld, that if you have a problem, the way to deal with it is to enlarge it. What this suggests is that this dilemma they now face could lead to a riverboat gamble that could plunge the entire planet into incineration. Now, if you check your tapes, you'll see that on this program some days ago, I suggested that the North Atlantic Bloc would be trying to squeeze Kaliningrad, this Russian city, which in a sense is separated from the major body of Russian territory, bracketed by Poland and Lithuania. And voila, what do we see as we speak? A pressure on Kaliningrad, which is going to be the source, I'm afraid to say, of a major crisis. And let me make another prediction. And once again, one does not have to have a crystal ball to come up with these predictions. It's just knowing imperialism. Another crisis, I dare say, will erupt at the top of the world in the Arctic, where already you see contestation between Canada and the United States. We know that Canada, in some ways, is more hawkish despite having a population of a mere 38 million, than the United States of America. Recall that it's Canada that has refused to release a turbine to Gazprom that had been sent by the German company Siemens to Canada for repair, that has caused Gazprom, the Russian natural gas giant, to curtail gas exports to Western Europe. Now, obviously, Canada is the culprit here, but somehow that's being ignored, and Gazprom is being denounced roundly in many Western European capitals. And Canada also happens to have a significant number of right-wing Ukrainian exiles, including Chrystia Freeland, who is one of Prime Minister Trudeau's top aides. She's served in many posts, including deputy prime minister, the equivalent of foreign minister, et cetera, and it's tipped to replace Mr. Trudeau whenever he plans to step down. And it's no secret that over recent years, there has been conflict in the Arctic region between Canada and Russia. I expect that, pardon the expression, to heat up in coming days and weeks. That will be another pressure point that seems to me another attempt to enlarge the crisis in order to escape the crisis. Please don't expect me to explain the illogic of that particular position, but there you have it. Because the North Atlantic countries, you mentioned BRICS, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
In your introductory remarks, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa.
Yes.
And now I think that BRICS may be joined by four other nations, MITI, Mexico, Iran, Turkey, and Indonesia, which would give BRICS membership and GDP larger than that of the so-called G7, led by the United States, Germany, and Japan. So there are a number of crises that these nations are facing, and it's unclear to me how they're going to escape it unless they decide to just blow up the whole world.
Let me put two things together. The U.S. President Biden recently said at some point this is going to be a bit of a waiting game. What the Russians can sustain and what Europe is going to be prepared to sustain, saying, you know, there's going to be pain and who can take the most pain. Here's another article. Nearly 80,000 people in Brussels protest high cost of living. We know that there has been protests in the UK. There's been the railway people. There's also now the barristers, the lawyers that are government lawyers for, provided for anyone that goes to jail. They're saying they're not making enough. They're talking about striking. So while President Biden says, well, let's see who can take the most pain, it certainly appears. Oh, might I add one other thing? Inflation in Russia is now going down. So the Russians are taking less and less pain. And it seems to me that this thing is going to kind of blow to pieces from the inside out, and starting with the EU. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Starting with the EU, and let me point you to the import of the recent French parliamentary elections. Just like France broke away from Washington's apron strings in the wake of the disastrous 1956 French, British, and Israeli attack on Egypt, just like France preceded the United States in recognizing the People's Republic of China years before the United States chose to do so, with the growth of the left and the parliamentary elections in France, don't be surprised if France decides to gradually peel away from the North Atlantic bloc and seek to cut a deal with the Chinese-led bloc. And speaking of the Chinese-led bloc, once again, the logic of the North Atlantic countries is breathtaking. We're told repeatedly that China is the big enchilada, China is the ball game, Russia is insignificant, as noted, it's a gas station masquerading as a nation. So why are the North Atlantic countries bogged down confronting Russia when China is the whole ball game? It makes little or no sense from their point of view, but I think it bespeaks the fact that they unavoidably and predictably miscalculate. Of course, you can see that, too, with regard to domestic politics, with surprise, surprise. There was an attempted coup d'etat, which goes against what we've been told in school about this sturdy democracy being inaugurated in 1776. So if they cannot figure out their own domestic politics, why should we expect them to figure out global politics?
Germany on the verge of gas emergency. The so-called alarm phase in Germany is triggered when there is a disruption in the gas supply or an exceptionally high demand for gas, which leads to a significant deterioration of the supply situation by the market, but the market is still able to cope with the disruption. The interesting thing about Germany is not only its position within the EU economic strata, but also the manufacturing aspects of this and the pressure that the slowdown or shutdown in manufacturing is going to have on Olaf Scholz. Again, pick a country, and this thing seems to be deteriorating and deteriorating at a rapid rate. So not only is it going to be a matter of people not being able to heat their homes in Germany, it's going to be a matter of, can you get a Mercedes-Benz? Can you get a BMW? Can you get your Krupp coffee machine, Bosch refrigerator, or tail lights? Dr. Horne, this again, how could they have made such a dramatic blunder?
Well, here's a stock tip for you. Given the fact that I fully expect many Western Europeans to be freezing in the dark in a few months because of the curtailing of natural gas exports from Gazprom of Russia, you may want to invest in woolen socks, woolen mittens, woolen sweaters, and then begin shipping them into London, Berlin, Paris, etc. This is the scale of the miscalculation that has been made. And it also speaks to your point, which is that these are exporting nations, particularly Germany. And how are they going to export without adequate energy? How are they going to export when everybody knows that number 2 on the hit list is the People's Republic of China, which is a major export market of Germany in particular, which has helped to keep the German economy buoyant, which brings me back to France, because as France peels off from the North Atlantic bloc, we can fully expect it to influence Germany accordingly. And that will ultimately be disastrous for U.S. imperialism as the world moves in one direction and U.S. imperialism moves in the other direction. It's the equivalent of trying to ride a horse going in different directions at the same time. The rider, speaking of Washington, will be sprawling in the dust sooner rather than later.
And as we get out, if you throw on top of that the longer-term deindustrialization of the United States, as well as this idea of just-in-time manufacturing, I mean, all of these things now, as Malcolm said, the chickens are coming home to roost. Or as Brother Ed used to say when I was in high school at Christian Brothers High School in Sacramento, you're a victim of your own event. We got 30 seconds.
Well, certainly. And the building up of China, which is essential to supply lines for Apple and other U.S. corporations, is part and parcel of the dilemma and crisis now faced by U.S. imperialism, because now Secretary Janet Yellen is telling us that the United States needs to move to friendshoring. That is to say, only offshoring production amongst friends. But China was once a friend. That's why they created those supply lines there. Who is to say that Vietnam, which supposedly will be a beneficiary of friendshoring, will consistently be a friend of U.S. imperialism? As a student of history, I would not wager on that.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
You're listening to the Critical Hour on radio.